Welcome to the Mediation PodCAST, where we talk all things mediation. I'm your host, Shelley-Anne Salisbury, an accredited mediator. In this podcast, I'll be talking to a range of dispute resolution professionals from all over the world and from a variety of disciplines about mediation from their unique perspectives. Like me, they all believe mediation to be a powerful tool in dispute resolution. Mediation can avoid escalating legal costs and the unpredictability of court cases, not to mention the emotional rollercoaster of litigation, which can often stretch out over many years. Lee Jay Berman began as a full-time mediator 27 years ago and has since mediated over 2,600 matters. Lee is a distinguished fellow with the International Academy of Mediators and a dispute resolution expert with the United Nations Development Programme. Lee Jay has trained mediators, judges, attorneys, and business leaders worldwide and has published numerous articles on mediation and alternative dispute resolution. The American Bar Association will be publishing 2 of his books this year. Welcome, Lee Jay. How are you doing?
I'm great, Shelley-Anne. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure. And on the Mediation podcast, we're going to mix things a bit and we're going to change our usual format. So as listeners know, I chat with mediators, find out about them, what they've done, how they got to be mediators or conflict resolution specialists. And we chat about that in a general way. But what I wanted to do, we're going to actually look at a particular case study. And it's one that you sent me. You actually sent me 4. And I chose one of them because I really found the facts fascinating, and listeners, you will see why in a moment. And we're going to analyze it and see how Lee Jay managed to achieve a successful resolution using mediation skills and techniques. So Lee Jay, why don't you tell us the facts of the case, which I understand involve a pretty well-known and very successful rock band. So I'm going to hand over to you and I'm going to interject as and when to hear this fascinating tale unfold. Over to you, Lee Jay.
Wonderful, Shelley-Anne. So yes, it was, this particular case was a rock band. I work with a lot of them. And this one was just so classic and so textbook that it makes, I think, for an interesting case study because of the personalities in the room, because of the conflict, the level of conflict they were having. They were referred to me by their business manager because they were truly on the verge of breaking up. And the business manager said, this band will not make for 4 good solo artists. They really need to stay together. That's the magic. But they're angry with each other. There's high conflict. And I want to send them to you to see what you can do to help them resolve all of that. So that's how it's set up.
And had you already been involved in this type of industry as a mediator before?
Yes, coming up early in my mediation career, I had family and friends who were in the music business, and I'd worked with lots of bands in their younger stages and middle stages. This may have been the first one who had enjoyed the success that they had enjoyed. They'd been together at that point 15 years. They sold 10 million records, and I learned during the mediation, never had a partnership agreement between them. Like I literally asked them, who owns the name and who owns the logo? And they looked at each other and shrugged and said, I guess we all do. I mean, they were a band that was that successful and earning as much money as they were. They really had nothing other than handshake agreements in place, and those were falling apart.
It's amazing how that industry and similar types of industries, it's not uncommon. So this band had no agreement and were quite advanced in their career. So pretty unhelpful at that point.
Yes. And like you said, surprising. I mean, they had a big record label deal. They had professional management. They even had a band lawyer, but they never had an agreement.
Wow.
Yeah, really interesting way to start. When I met them and they walked in the room, they were barely talking to one another. As I understood it, the lead singer and his family were on one tour bus, while the other 3 guys and their significant others were on the other tour bus. And they would arrive at the venue, they would get on stage and play and get back in their separate buses. It was that icy cold. They were just frustrated with each other and their personality dynamics, quite frankly. It was really an interesting situation because they were making money, a lot of money, and dependent on each other, and yet had no relationship at that point in time.
And that's also quite interesting because you would imagine that artists need some kind of rapport, bouncing off each other, even playing on stage. So it was one of them who was on their own, and the other three band members were still friendly at this point. So that was the conflict between three of them as one group, and then the other one.
Okay. Exactly. And the other three said, we don't have any interest in replacing him because he's not really replaceable. And each of the four of them had been off doing side projects. Either they'd assembled new bands and new projects, or they were going to do a solo thing. And they were all poised and ready to go off in separate directions. I mean, they had already begun their separate ventures, each of the four of them. And the question was, are we really going to get back together and do another album and go on tour again? Or is this just done because we can't get along any longer?
Right. And at that point in their career, could they have just made that decision to go their separate ways because financially they were able to do so?
Not really, especially the three band members. So the one who was on his own, he had written most of the music. So he had the royalty money coming in from the writing royalties. The other three were dependent on performing, because the way this model works today, it's very different than when I was a kid. They used to put concerts on and you would buy a ticket for $7 in the hopes that you would go out and buy this album and the next album, which were $14 at the time or something like that. Now it's reversed. Now they almost give the music away so that you'll buy the concert ticket, which here in the States can be a couple of $100 to go see this band play. So the other three guys were dependent on the constant income of the touring. And the fourth guy, who was on his own, basically boycotted touring for the entire last year before they came to me. They only played a couple of handfuls of gigs the entire year. So the three guys whose income was dependent on that touring were now at his mercy a little bit.
Okay, so you had the main guy, who's the writer, who obviously makes the most, and it sounds like a bit almost like punishing the other three. And the other three are just stuck. The manager called you in, I understand, but did they go to the manager and say, we've got to sort this out because of this financial dilemma that we're in?
Yes. So I think each of them had conversations with the manager, blaming the other and all that sort of thing. And let's remember, when a band starts to become successful and starts to tour and starts to, become a big deal and they become a household name eventually, the managers and the agents and those people make percentages of that revenue. So when this one member went on strike, so to speak, and the revenues plummeted, so did the revenues of all of the business people, the managers and everybody else associated with the band. So everybody was sort of panicked. It was as though the goose that laid the golden egg was in danger here. That's why the manager called me to say, this is working for everybody. Let's not let it fall apart.
Right. Okay. So everyone's at the mercy of this one band member. Again, he knows it. We've got this sort of power play thing going on. And at this point, when you were called in, did you have any indication that there had been talks or discussions between the manager, lawyer, and the band member, or band members to band members?
Great question. So the first thing I do in a situation like this was not a litigated case. They all had their own individual lawyers, but they were more consulting lawyers who would review a potential contract if one was put in place, but they weren't involved in the mediation like they would have been if it was litigation. So the four guys all came and sat with me for 12 hours, and then a week later, 12 more hours. And when they walked in the first morning, so first of all, before they walked in the door, I had a good hour or so phone call with each of the four of them separately. I wanted to hear each of their perspectives of what was going on, what the challenges had been, what they thought solutions might look like, what their alternative looked like for them if it didn't work out. And so I went through this with each of the four of them so that when they walked in the room, I already had some semblance of relationship with them. There was a comfort level. They could talk to me. They understood, I think they trusted at that point, that I had their best interest in mind. And I stressed to all of them the most important thing about mediation, I think, which is nobody's going to make you do anything today you don't want to do. So they could all walk in relaxed and ready to listen. And what I did when they walked in the door the first morning is I said, I've talked with each of you. I understand some of the difficulties. I understand there are difficulties in the finances. There are disagreements about touring and the music and all those sorts of things. And this one guy who was on his own had made some demands and said, if I'm going to stay, I want this percentage of the pie, which was the overwhelming majority of the pie for himself. And I want complete dictatorial rights over the music. I make every musical decision and I mean, some very, very heavy demands on the other three.
Right. Just going back a little bit, what you said earlier about having separate conversations with each of them, it's very important, isn't it, in mediation to do that, because you have to give each member of the band, in this case, each party to the mediation, absolute equal time and space to tell it as it is from their perspective, because that's what mediation does. Nobody's putting words in their mouth. This is them speaking to you about their personal concerns. And you also made it very clear that there was no judgment here. You're not going to make a decision. This is voluntary. And obviously it's, as we all know, it's always confidential. So already you set up a very nice introduction, having understood what their particular concerns are before you actually walk in and meet them in person. And then you get the disparity between the demands of the one guy, which sound like they were probably quite high and potentially unreasonable, knowing you're going to have your work cut out.
Exactly right. There's an important differentiation between the process and the content of the process that we're talking about. And in the process, you're right, all four guys had to have an equal voice. Even if at the end of this process, the outcome was that they ended up with less than their 25% or more than, that's the content that we're talking about. But process-wise, in any rock band, any entertainment situation especially, and also we're dealing with egos all the way around. So all four of these guys saw themselves as successful musicians who contributed to the overall success of this band. And at one point, not too far into the first day, I asked them each to pull out a piece of paper and to write down, out of 100% pie, what percentage of that pie did they think each of the four members, including themselves, contributed? So, and I said, it's going to be confidential. I'm not going to disclose it. Give me your honest opinion of what percentage you think you contribute and everybody else in the band one by one. Then I collected the four pieces of paper and I left the room and went in the next room and tabulated them. And I came back to inform them that if I added up how each of them rated their own contribution to the band, the total of those four numbers was 180%. A single person in the band had quite clearly, by definition, overrated their own contribution to the band because the number would have been almost double if each of them had been accurate about their own. So they all felt they contributed a lot. And that tells me that there was a lacking in that room of recognition and appreciation between the four of them. Everybody was focused on their own contribution and not giving enough credit to the others for doing what they did.
Right. So you're starting to come to the real nub of the issues here. And we're talking about rock bands and who gets what, but really we're coming onto that thing where people feel they're not being given enough recognition, not being heard, not having their say, and that is causing their tension and the conflict. So you already know what you're dealing with, which I'm sure wasn't a huge surprise for you at this point.
Oh, not at all. And it was interesting to watch them as this unfolded, and they all kind of had the light bulbs go on over their heads where they realized the dynamic had to be different if the band was going to survive. So the very first question I asked them all when they walked in the room together, I said, 3 out of the 4 of you have small children. On any given Tuesday, you get up, and we're all in Southern California. So I said, you get up, and instead of going to the beach with your kids for the day, you get up instead and you do the band thing, whether that means going into the studio or writing music or rehearsing or getting on an airplane somewhere to go play a gig. What makes you choose the band thing over a day at the beach with your family? What about that drives you toward the band thing?
Great question.
It was so much fun because what we really got down to was what mattered for each of them. And it was so wonderful because the first guy says, I love the music. I think our music is a really special variety of music. And I love playing our music. I love writing our music. And that's what draws me to this band instead of some other band out there. I said, great. The second guy says, I play lead guitar. I love coming down stage and watching all the arms in the air and the girls screaming. And he said, playing live and that energy, you can't get it anywhere else. That's what I love. And I love the way we play fires people up and they're having an experience, which makes us have an experience. And that's what he fed off of was the live gigs. The third guy said, literally, I think we have the ability to be one of the great bands of all time. I think when we're done, we have the potential to sit alongside the Beatles and the Stones as one of the great bands in history. And I think it would be a crying shame if we walked away from this before we saw if we could accomplish that. And at this point, as mediator, my heart's melting. I'm loving everything that I'm. These were four great guys. I mean, I really liked the guys individually. Each one of them were just great people. We all turned to the fourth guy. Oh, go ahead.
Would it have mattered to you if you didn't like them and you thought they were just really egotistical brats?
I didn't have time during the mediation. After the fact, I absolutely thought about it. And your question, I think what would have changed if they were egotistical brats or if they were slimy or jerks or something else, my job would have been the same. Harder slogging because they tend to resist and push back and they don't really answer your questions. They question your questions and all that sort of thing. We've all had that kind of experience as mediators. And at the end of the day, I've had days, we all have, right, Shelley-Anne, where we just want to go home and take a hot shower and scrub really hard because we've been surrounded by just icky people sometimes. This was one of those days where I really liked these guys and I wanted them to be successful. So I had, I think, probably more enthusiasm. And I think I maybe was a little bit more invested.
Okay, that's an honest answer, and I appreciate that. Well, they got very lucky, I think, as well, because to have a mediator who has that sort of extra level of investment can only be a plus. So now you have the fourth guy, and what about him?
So before we go to the fourth guy, at a very advanced mediator level, one of the things we have to be aware of is if they can see that I'm enthusiastic about helping them, and they can feel that I want this to work for them and they're safe, it actually gives them more license to let more of the conflict out. It makes it okay for them to not be on their best behavior, and they can have the temper tantrum, or they can point at the guy across the room and say, you're the third freaking bass player we've had. We can have a fourth tomorrow, and then apologize for it and all of that. But that comes out only when they feel safe with us. If I'm just a guy and a stranger, don't have connection with them, and if they hadn't talked to me beforehand and all of that, then they're on their best behavior because they're not as invested themselves.
Right. So you created a warmth and a connection. Connection's really important, isn't it? Clearly, the confidence you were exuding, because you do, people can tell if you're not confident in a mediation. It's instant. You know when somebody is just out of their depth.
Yes. So two things. One, I heard loud and clear when I had my pre-calls, 2 of the 4 of them used the phrase a couple of times each, saying, I'm not sure I'll bring this up at the meeting, but I want you to know that this is the underlying thing going on. So that tells me as mediator, I've got to make it safe enough in that room for them to bring that up because that's the real issue. So that was part of it. But the other thing, to your point about they're sizing you up instantly, when I'm training new mediators, Sheryl Crow did a song years ago on her first album called Are You Strong Enough to Be My Man? And so I twist that and say, they walk in the room and the first question they're asking themselves is, are you strong enough to be my mediator? Can you make the other person understand what I'm not able to make them understand? So you're absolutely right. They're sizing up the mediator's confidence and presence from hello. So we've got one guy who loves the music, one guy who loves performing live. We've got one guy who thinks they could achieve all-time greatness. I can't wait to see what the fourth guy is going to say. We all turn to him and he says, money. And the other guys laugh and roll their eyes like, typical, that's that guy. And he said, no, I'm not kidding. Think about this. I'm 10 years away from being a short, balding, funny-looking man who nobody's going to want to pay to come see in a rock band. I've got 10 years to put as much money aside for my kids and their college education and our home and our future. And this clock is ticking. And I know I've got 10 years to make this happen. And after that, I'm behind the camera. I'm producing or I'm writing or something, but I'm not performing anymore. Everybody kind of went, oh, we didn't think of it that way, because he was more the business thinker, I think.
Were they all around the same age, or was he the oldest?
They were all about the same age.
That's quite unusual, isn't it? Because when you're in that sort of rock band setup, you just ride on this adoration, I guess. I mean, let's look at a band like the Rolling Stones, for example. Mick Jagger keeps going and going and going. He's pretty near to the point where you think, come on, but they don't, because I don't think they see themselves as what they are now. They live in their glory days, right?
Yes.
So, kudos to this guy in a way. for being so realistic. So like any soccer stars or anybody who uses their physical talents, they have a finite life. Maturing is not great, right?
Right. If you're performing and you're in front of people, and like you said, you're either a world-class athlete, and obviously I've mediated with some of those too, or you're a performer out in front, you do have a limited lifespan. It's actually perishable. And your career's, the average career of a footballer is got to be 4 or 5 years on average at the most. I mean, I know with American football, it's like 3.5 years. They spend their whole life preparing for that. So we pay them a lot of money and then they're kind of on their own at 25 years old or something.
Yeah. So you have a very smart guy, a realistic guy who understands he's got his window and he wants to make as much money as he can in that window. We always talk as mediators of moving from positions to interests, trying to get people out of their own position, because that's never going to be helpful. Everyone just tries to push down into that position and dig further. And of course, as you know, it's linked with ego. So you attack position, you're attacking ego. Bad situation. So you're trying to now move them towards common interest and to find out what they need from this. So tell me how that then played out.
That's the beauty of it. Discovering it is, I think, the mental challenge for the mediator, to listen to everything and hear it and discover it, but then to mold it together into a solution, to weave it into a fabric they can all sort of get on board with. So the first thing I helped them think about was if they were going to stay together as a band, every person had to focus more on making sure the other 3 guys got what they needed if this was going to work. So can we help this guy get that he needs? Can we help this guy get on stage more? Can we, help this guy by challenging ourselves to create new music and all of that? By the way, I just heard me say ourselves, and I just want to footnote, mediators and mental health professionals and everybody have always said to me, don't put yourself in the same lifeboat as your patients, like especially therapists and so on. I do. And that's unusual, but it's worked for me my whole career. I jump in the lifeboat with them and say, which way are we rowing? And what if we rowed this way? Let's go explore what happened if we did that. So I'm in this with them very much so until they leave me and go away.
I love the fact you raised that, because I do that sometimes. And I think, oh, hold on a second, I've got to distance myself here. But actually, I think there's a difference between being part of something and being involved in finding that solution. There is a difference. And I think just from my experience, people like the fact that you roll your sleeves up and you say, I'm in it. I'm in for the long run here. I'm with you all. I'm not siding. I'm not judging, but I'm jumping into the deep with you. And we're going to work together. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. So just to put the end before the middle, at the end, they said to me, we couldn't have done this without you ever. And thank you, because we're back together because of what you've been able to do with us. I mean, they were really grateful. They really appreciated that I was in this with them. And we'd spent 2 12-hour days together behind closed doors and never broke off into separate meetings with any of them, except for one bad behavior moment that lasted about 3 minutes. But other than that, we all sat in the same room the entire time.
Right from the beginning. So no caucus. It was all open session. Obviously, you had your pre-mediation private sessions with them. So you've done a lot of that in advance, which is so helpful. And you have an understanding of what their individual needs are. Great. A lot of mediators use shuttle diplomacy as an absolute standard. When people don't want to be in a room together, you don't put them in a room straight away, of course. But if you don't get them into the room together at some point, I believe it's much harder for them to come to an understanding. You almost have to get over that uncomfortableness and see each other and look each other in the face and recognize the human that you're dealing with. And the problem is separate to that.
I completely agree. I also think about people who are visual versus auditory and kinesthetic in how they process information. So I never put them all in the same room when they arrive first thing. In Los Angeles, if they're coming to my office, they have fought traffic and parking, and they've been stressing since the night before about the big day coming up. The person that's making your life miserable right now, and share a cup of coffee, So I meet with them separately. I listen to their stories a bit. I go through some ground rules, but mostly I pull them together so that I can go through also a bit of a paradigm shift to make them realize they need each other to get this resolved. They can't just fight and expect that something's going to come out differently at the end. But what it mostly does is exactly what you just said, Shelley-Anne. It gives them a chance to look across the table, even if it's on the sly with a quick glance, and see the other person. What are they wearing? What do they look like? Are they as stressed out as I am? And hold that in their minds for the rest of the day even if they're in separate rooms the entire rest of the day. But I think it depends on the kind of case. And I think too many mediators have their way of doing things. And as you're alluding to, I think that's a mistake. I think we have all these tools at our disposal, and the parties in the conflict depend on us to use our experience to figure out when to use these tools, when to bring them together, when to have them set apart, and what to do in each situation. In a situation like this, where it's all about their relationship, if these guys were going to stay together and go back on the road, and long story short, of course they did, they went back on the road after this experience, and in the very next year, almost tripled their best year ever because they were in sync with each other. That was not the name of the band, but they were connected and understood each other's goals. And these guys were so sharp. They made a 2-year agreement coming out of this first mediation and agreed to come back in 2 years to sit with me again to review how it had worked, to see if it needed to be fine-tuned. And then they made a 3-year agreement and came back at the end of 3 years. So I had a relationship with these guys that spanned 8 or 9 years of meeting with them at different intervals and checking in. And so all that trust and all of that familiarity that was created at the very, very beginning with those individual phone calls and with that first day together lasted through the entire place. I've been at other festivals and things where I've run into them. And backstage, these guys are coming up and shoving off their fans and coming over to give me a huge hug because we developed this relationship and helped them through a difficult time, coming out the other end, not feeling like somebody had taken a hammer to their heads and made them do something, but instead help them really find their interests and find their bandmates' interests. And I think the way it came out had as much to do with it as the fact that it came out okay.
Amazing. And these interval reconnections with them, was that your idea or did they ask for that?
It was negotiated. At the very beginning, everybody was a little bit skeptical because the way we built the first proposal, these guys were so sharp. We literally took my computer with an Excel spreadsheet and a projector up onto the wall, and we were tweaking numbers and doing all this sort of thing. And what we decided is, coming back to the incentive that each of the 4 of them had that was different. We decided that, for example, the one guy who was on his own needed to be incented to come out and tour where he had been wanting to stay home and kind of on strike, as we talked about. In order to get him out, they incented him with a much higher percentage split of the first dollars until the other 3 guys got to a level of income in that formula that they could say, okay, at that point, I'm comfortable. Beyond that point, I am willing to work differently. So from 0 to that level set point where the other 3 guys all felt like they'd earned enough that they were financially secure, they incented him heavily to come out and tour. Then they went back to a 25-25 split across the board until they got to the amount they had earned in their best year ever, which was like 2 years before. Once they hit that threshold, then they incented people differently from that point forward with different percentages of the money and the revenues and all that sort of thing. So they built a very complex formula with breakpoints and different percentages. And we were running all these numbers in a spreadsheet on the wall, and people were asking and moving different numbers around until everybody was satisfied.
And at this point, were accountants, lawyers, support staff involved? I mean, were you doing all of this?
Yes. Yeah. So one of my benefits is I've got a good head for numbers. So we put that all together and did it all on our own in that room by ourselves. And here was the other thing. So I mentioned the band had a band lawyer, and each of the guys had their own separate sort of consulting counsel. So what I did before they came in the first day, I had them put me in touch with the band's lawyer. And I said, these guys don't have a partnership agreement. They need one. I said, send me 2 other partnership agreements that you've done for other bands, redact all the personal identifying information, but I want to be able to see every subject that you want to include in that agreement so that I can make sure we cover that in the mediation. So the second full day of mediation was about all the other partnership concerns, right survivorship and ownership of, the name and the logo and deals on publishing if they wanted to alter any of that. So we went through all of the buyout agreements, all of that stuff on the second day so that we could turn over a memorandum of understanding to the lawyer who then turned it into a legal partnership agreement. And then each of them had their lawyers review it. And at that point, the business manager just said, I'm hands off. I trust them and I trust you. Just give me the final agreement and we'll divide the money the way they tell us to. And the mediator's thinking has to be outside of the box, outside of the room we're sitting in. Almost every single entertainment case, especially the ones in litigation, that I can ever remember mediating has always had an addendum, an attachment to the final settlement agreement that's called the press release. And we will settle the case and the financial and other aspects of the case. And then we'll sit right there with the lawyers and the managers and everybody in the room, and we will jointly write a press release that everybody agrees to and that everybody agrees will be the only thing released that will talk about the settlement of this litigation. And it ends up being, it's Hollywood. So it ends up being, well, the producer and the star on this movie worked out, you may have read about disputes, but everything has worked out. We're glad to finally announce the release of this movie coming to a theater near you. And the star, here's a quote about the movie from her. And here's a quote from the director, and it becomes a puff piece to move the public into getting ready to want to see the movie and to stop talking about the conflict between the star and the producer in Hollywood, especially, and also in big corporations or family businesses that are intimate. How a dispute is framed and shared is as important as the resolution of it to begin with. So I don't feel like my work is done until we've resolved the dispute and agreed on how we're going to walk it out going forward from here.
Yeah, because again, you can come to an agreement and then everyone leaves the room. You think you've done your job and it falls apart because it's not binding. I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it, about mediation? Unless you turn it into a binding arrangement, it's not. And one of the mediator's jobs also is not finished at the end of the day. It's, it's dotting the I's and crossing the T's and making sure there's nothing left untied that can just unravel the whole tapestry that you've created. And that's a really big part of mediation that I'm not sure many people do get.
I agree with you. I do something that I think is counterintuitive at the end of a mediation. Most mediators are thrilled to get a deal and quick shake hands, let's get the ink dry and all of that. I do the opposite. I've watched you, Shelley-Anne. We've had a couple of meetings in preparation for this podcast. You have a real keen sense for people. And I know that at the end of a mediation, when somebody is saying fine and they're just kind of going along, but you have that feeling in your own gut, like they're going to go home tonight and change their mind or wake up in the morning and say, what did I do? So some mediators just get the agreement signed and ink is on the paper and we're good and cross their fingers. I take them into a separate room and say, help me understand. This morning you came in at 9:00 and said you were never going to do more than X today. Now here we are about to sign a settlement agreement where you're about to agree to 2.5 times X. Help me understand for you what changed since we walked in this morning. What did you learn? What changed your mind? And help me understand how you're going to explain when you go home to your husband, your wife, your parents, your adult child, whoever I call it the imaginary board of directors, whoever you're going to go home and explain this to, help me understand what happened today. And they'll say, well, I didn't know this and I learned that and I had to think about the risk of this and I realized it was going to cost more than I thought to do or whatever. But they're going to give me their reasons for why they did it. And I like to do that for 2 reasons. One, it reaffirms the agreement in their minds. So now they're not thinking that there's an option to go home tonight and change their minds. And two, they have their own voice in their heads with all of these reasons why they agreed to do this, rather than me telling them this is a great idea because you're getting this, you're getting this, you're getting this, but that's my voice. I want them to have their own voice in their heads as they're driving home or whatever. So when they walk in the door to their significant person and say, I agreed to this, and the significant person says, you did what? They can say, hold on, let me explain to you why. Yeah. So this is, again, the mediator thinking about what happens after they walk out my door and what can I do here now before they do that to make that better, to come up with an agreement that lasts rather than just an agreement they can sign off on here and now.
You're speaking complete music to me, I have to say, because as a lawyer, when I used to negotiate, if I ever, towards the end, before we signed, or even just, a day before we were signing, if I felt there was a conflict still or something wasn't right, I would stop the process and I say, listen, there is something that's not quite right. If we don't address the issue that I think I can spot's going on here, and we don't resolve it, this agreement will be torn up and wasted. And I don't want to do that. At the end of the day, easy, sign an agreement, move on. It gets torn up and the litigation take over. That's not the way I see that should be, because people with a conflict are miserable. It is horrible to be in a conflict situation. You help people remove the yoke of conflict. And that's what drives, I think, good mediators. And I can't sit back and watch this. So what you've just said is, I don't want anybody to walk away from this mediation driving home and thinking, what the heck have I done? They know why they did it because you asked them to explain it. So at the end of this, it looks like 2 12-hour mediations that you had with your rock band. And by the way, listeners, we're not allowed to say who the rock band are, and I cannot get it out of Lee Jay. I wouldn't dream of it being all in confidence, but you spent these 2 full days with them. You then had subsequent mediations, just checking in on them. And it was obviously very successful. How are things today with this band? Are they still together? Are they still good? Did they take on board things that you had sort of discussed with them? What was the longevity of this?
Even better than I could have imagined. When they came back for the third meeting, the guy who had been off on his own had engaged the others and said, I think we need every month for each one of us to have a 30-minute sit down, virtually or in person if we're all together and in the same city or whatever, and just check in. How's everything going? What do we need to do differently for you to get what you want out of this? And he started setting up those regular meetings between all of the guys one-on-one, because he was sold on the concept that they had to change the communication between them and they had to make sure everybody's interests were being met. How's the band doing today? You are driving around in your car singing their songs with them on the radio today, I can promise you.
Oh, that is good news. And just finally, I hope you'll say yes. Are they traveling together in the same tour bus?
Well, now they're on airplanes, but yes, they are.
Oh, they've moved on.
But yes, they absolutely are.
Good. I'm delighted to hear that, because that is a complete success story. And I just want to thank you, Lee Jay, for sharing your insights based around a real case. It's so important that we hear something that did happen. You were there. You created a most amazing ending to what could have been a disaster. And that's down to obviously your expertise and your own passion for mediation. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Shelley-Anne, it's been my pleasure. I love your show because you get into what's real and not just theoretical about the work that we do. And I think anybody listening to this can relate to that. And I'm looking forward to future episodes.
You've been listening to the Mediation Podcast with me, Shelley-Anne Salisbury. Subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Links for my guests can be found on my website, themediationpod.net, as well as on my social media platforms, LinkedIn and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please leave feedback in the comments section on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode.